Hello and welcome to LFC Focus. It is pre-match build-up showtime as Liverpool look to bounce back from the disappointing draw against West Bromwich Albion at Anfield with a trip to St James's Park on Wednesday evening to, of course, play Steve Bruce's Newcastle United side. It's an 8 o'clock kickoff, just a little bit more than a 72-hour turnaround after the last game, which of course isn't always the best thing. We know how much Jurgen Klopp doesn't like those quick turnarounds because of how little time it gives for recovery and time to work through things on the training ground as well. But I think under these circumstances, it might actually be exactly what the players need. I think it was interesting the way they did look rather sluggish against West Brom, even though they'd had a full 8 days even rest between then and their last game. You would have thought that they would have been able to come flying out of the blocks. I think sometimes in an almost counterintuitive way, this Liverpool team actually benefits from playing a lot of games in a short space of time. Obviously, in the long term, that doesn't work out because gradually players get pushed closer and closer to the red zone and it leads to injuries. But when you are trying to build up momentum and create this winning mentality where the team just goes out and gets 3 points over and over and over again, we kind of saw it last season as well. I think actually playing a lot of games in a short space of time, as long as you've still got a reasonable gap between them, is actually beneficial. And of course, we've managed to avoid that 48-hour turnaround, which can be such a killer at this time of year. So I think it's actually ended up being quite a good opportunity for Liverpool to look to bounce back from a poor result as quick as possible. And that is something that I think we have done very, very well under Klopp. You rarely see this Liverpool side, especially over the last couple of years. I think since the kind of turning point was after Kiev, I think it's fair to say they don't tend to get in ruts. And one thing that they have managed to get around is the fact that normally, in the early stages under Klopp, this stage of the season, the January, February bit that we're now starting to get into, was often a bit of a stumbling block. We'd see performances drop away, intensity would fall away, and the results would follow as well. We'd tend to drop a couple places down the league table and cup campaigns would suffer as well as a result of the drop-off in performances that we saw. Recently, though, that seems to have turned around, and hopefully, despite the fact that this is a season like no other, this will be no different. And I think the nature of this game we've got against Newcastle is almost, like I said, the perfect scenario for us to bounce back from the West Brom game, because it is a relatively similar setup, and you feel like Liverpool will be looking at this and thinking we don't want to make the same mistakes twice. Like I said, we tend to bounce back from poor performances under Klopp. We don't tend to get into those January, February ruts anymore where the poor results start to stack up. If things don't go our way in one match, then you'll be able to tell in the next few, because Liverpool will look to turn things around very quickly. The most recent example being after the disappointing draw and performance against Fulham, we then went on to put in a fantastic performance against Spurs, beating our title rivals at home with a late winner, and then of course we absolutely demolished Crystal Palace. So fingers crossed Liverpool can pull off a similar kind of coup with this game against Newcastle. Like I said, it's probably going to be a similar setup. You'd expect them to defend relatively deep. I'll come on to how I'm expecting them to set up a little bit later on in the video, but just in terms of the vague dynamic of the game, I don't think it'll be quite the level of what the first half was against West Brom, where it was 21 men in a single half, and at some points even 21 men in a single third of the pitch. But I do think Newcastle, their main priority in terms of how they will look to get a result from this game will be to try and shut Liverpool down, defend deep, defend resolutely, and then everything else they will hope to fall into place at either side of that. But of course, it's Liverpool's job to make sure that doesn't happen. And in terms of who Liverpool will actually have available to make sure that doesn't happen, we've had a little bit of interesting team news going into this game. Jurgen Klopp didn't do a press conference today, which took, I think, a few of us by surprise. Anyone who pays attention to those sorts of things and looks to them for news on which players are and aren't going to be available, as I often do for these videos, will have noticed that he didn't do one as he normally does before the game. It actually came straight after the West Brom game, which is a little bit bizarre, whether that was always planned or Klopp requested that, because as we have kind of been able to tell this season, he doesn't really like doing lots of press conferences, especially when it's just every 3 days he sits in front of all the cameras and the reporters and tells them who else is now injured. So he didn't really do a pre-match press press conference per se, but he did speak about Thiago, who is of course on all of our minds going into this game. It was kind of mooted that either West Brom or this was going to be the game that we finally saw him come back after he returned to full team training. Although what Jurgen Klopp said on Sunday evening, and crucially, plenty may have happened since then. Thiago has only really taken part in, I think, one session, and that was a relatively light session. He sort of fudged it a little bit. He didn't quite say clearly what exactly Thiago had done. Obviously, he doesn't want to make exactly clear whether or not he's going to be available, because we don't want Newcastle being able to plan for either a game with Thiago or without Thiago. We want them to have to try and spread themselves a little bit thinner by covering both bases. But what he did say was, don't put money on either side of it. Essentially, he said that it will also come down to what happens this week. There will have been sessions on Monday. There will have been sessions today. We haven't really seen how much of Thiago has been involved in those sessions. Of course, we can go off of pictorial evidence, but he may have just been there for the lighter parts of the session and all that kind of thing. So it's very much a 50-50, I think. And given the way Jurgen Klopp has been playing it this season, and especially the way he's spoken about players coming back from long-term injuries, I'd actually be a little bit surprised if we see any serious involvement from Thiago in this game. I think Jurgen Klopp will look to get him in the matchday squad. Of course, with 9 subs on the bench now, we've kind of got a little bit room to put more players in there. And as a result, it might actually be beneficial to Thiago just to get him into the squad and get him back into the rhythm. You know, he'll have to be on the pitch with all the subs warming up. He'll have to follow the whole matchday routine as well in terms of what they eat and how they prepare and everything like that. And it will make him feel like he's back being part of the team again. But in terms of whether or not he actually gets on the pitch, as Jurgen Klopp said, one session in training does not prepare you for the intensity of a match in the Premier League. So I think regardless of how good Thiago is and just how desperate we are to see him, I think we will err on the side of caution here. And while I think he will potentially be involved in the game, certainly in terms of the squad, I doubt he plays any serious involvement. I think it's more, if we are 3-0 up with 20 minutes to go, then Jurgen thinks, you know what, if he's warmed up fine and there's no issues there, no strains or niggles or anything whatsoever, then get him on the pitch, give him a little bit of time, and then he can really be ready to go for the game against Southampton a few days afterwards. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think we need to be certainly relying on Thiago to give us anything in this game. I think when it comes to actually trying to win the football match, we're going to have to look to other options in midfield, unfortunately. The other big injury news is, of course, what's going on with Joel Matip, that perennial question of whether or not his limbs that are made of crisps have once again crumbled. At the moment, we don't know for sure. He was reported to have a scan today so that Liverpool could determine the extent of the injury, so hopefully we find out over the next few days at least some prognosis of whether it's going to be short term or whether it's going to be long term. If it's long term, we probably won't be get given a numerical value of how long he's going to be out, whether it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks or 2 to 3 months or anything like that. But it would be nice to know whether it's going to be a couple of weeks or a couple of months, to know whether we can rely on him coming back soon or whether we are going to have to look to some other options. But in the meantime, he almost definitely isn't going to be available for this game, I think it's fair to say. And Jurgen Klopp does, of course, have a little bit of a headache on his hands, and not the kind of selection headache that he would like to have going into this game as to who he partners Fabinho, who will probably almost definitely start at centre-half with. So, as for how I think we are actually going to line up then, I think it is, of course, going to be Alisson Becker in goal, who will once again be a very important figure for Liverpool, especially given that we are rolling the dice and shuffling the pack with our back four. It's very good to have him behind them as kind of a more stable presence. I think we saw that in some ways having Alisson and a rather makeshift back four is actually not as bad as having the usual back four and then Adrian behind them. No disrespect to Adrian, more praise upon Alisson is essentially what I'm trying to deliver. So hopefully, regardless of who's in front of him, he will still be a calming and influential presence upon the team. In front of him, I think it will be Fabinho as a centre-half, and alongside him, I reckon we go with Nat Phillips for this game. It's essentially a straight shootout between Phillips or Reece Williams, unless you want to get a little bit creative and put someone like Jordan Henderson in there, or even go a little bit more wild and use the midfielders back three that we've seen just a couple of times before. Obviously, everyone kind of quotes that Brighton game that came years ago where we had Gini Van Alden and Emre Can as centre-halves in a back three, and it was all a little bit bizarre and out of the blue, and no one really knew how or why it had happened, but it worked. So we're kind of interested to see whether Jurgen will ever do it again. I don't think this is really the game to do it. I think we play it a little bit safe given everything else that's been going on to shake up the back line. So I think we go with Phillips over Williams for reasons that I'll come on to a little bit later, because it very much is a horses for courses thing. I think it comes down to Jurgen picking between Williams and Phillips based on the opponent, as we saw a little bit earlier on in the season where Nat Phillips played against West Ham because we knew they were going to pump the ball into the box and we needed an aerial presence that was going to be strong and win headers and be authoritative on set pieces and stuff like that. And then we used Williams in other games against opposition that prefer to have the ball on the floor, and we're going to maybe try and press the centre halves a little bit more. So I think Phillips starts alongside Fabinho. I think Trent and Robertson are going to be the fullbacks. I said in the pre-West Brom video that I thought we'd see a little bit more rotation, but with those two maybe in this game to give them a little bit of a rest. But given we've now lost Joel Matip, you don't really want to be making any more non-necessary changes to the back line. So I think we stick with the usual fullbacks. Ahead of them in midfield, I think Jordan Henderson retains his place in the side. Gini Wijnaldum retains his place in the side. And I think it's almost a given that one of the three from the game against West Brom is going to be rotated out for the sake of fitness, and also because we've got midfielders coming back now. Keita obviously has dropped out once again with an injury, and God only knows when he's going to be available. Jurgen hasn't given any update on that. But Ox is also back after making a cameo appearance against West Brom, and I don't know if I've mentioned James Milner already, but of course Thiago is going to be available as well. And Minamino's almost become an extra option in midfield as well. We've seen him playing that role a couple of times already this season. So the options are now there to rotate that weren't maybe there a few weeks ago. So I think it makes sense to bring someone out and also to freshen things up a bit. And I think given how he did perform reasonably well when he came on against West Brom, I would like to see Oxlade-Chamberlain once again. Obviously, he didn't necessarily change the game because he only had 10 minutes and he was coming back from injury and he was coming into a little bit of a mess of a football match, to be perfectly honest. He was subbed on straight after West Brom scored from the corner, which wasn't really an ideal position for him to be put in. But I think he did reasonably well and he offers something a little bit different, and the way he can break down those low blocks by bringing long shots into the side as well, which also draws defenders out, which creates space for Salah and Firmino and Mane. Also the fact he's very direct. He loves to drive forward with the ball. He gets it and he turns and he goes, and he's a real threat, and he moves a little bit quicker in terms of how quickly he moves the ball with one-touch passes and stuff like that. The kind of thing that I was praising him for after the West Brom game and would have loved to have seen more of, we unfortunately didn't get. I think will be very useful in breaking down what will probably be another stubborn defence from a lower Premier League side. So I think Ox comes in for Curtis Jones in this game, and then in front of them I think you have the usual front three. I think it has to be Salah, Firmino and Mane. So as for Newcastle then, while Liverpool do have problems of their own at the moment, things certainly aren't going that rosy for them either at the moment. In terms of players they are or aren't going to have available, it's looking like Callum Wilson might be back, which of course bolsters their options going forward, but they are still without Alan Sant-Maximin and Jamal Lascelles, who are both struggling with the long-term effects of contracting the coronavirus, unfortunately. So hopefully we see them back sooner rather than later. It's very unfortunate they're not going to be available, but from a Liverpool perspective, it certainly affects Newcastle in an adverse way. Sant-Maximin is a great outlet for them going forward, probably their most important talent. He's quite mercurial, a bit talismanic. A lot of things go through him, and he's quite a difficult player to deal with. He's got a lot of qualities that defenders don't like to come up against in a striker. And when you look at their other forward options, people like Joe Linton, they're just not, they don't strike fear into the heart in the same way that Sant-Maximin on a good day, I think, would to what is essentially a makeshift Liverpool defence. And Jamal Lascelles is also very, very vital for them at the back. You know, if they're going to look to go backs to the wall and put in a real strong defensive effort to try and shut Liverpool down, then Lascelles would have been very important to marshalling that. And without him, you do get the feeling that maybe there'll be slightly less defensive organisation. And of course, looking back to their previous game, they went to the Etihad to play against Man City, and there was definitely a lack of organisation defensively there. I think a lot of it looked like it was down to fatigue as well. Players struggling to, when they did get the ball away, it wasn't far. That when the ball was in the box, they didn't get it away quickly. It was getting cleared to players 10 yards away. Man City were getting second balls all the time. And also in terms of organisation, lots of players just not following runs in the way that you feel like if they weren't as fatigued, because of course they've been subjected to a very hectic schedule recently, and if they had someone like Lascelles in the back line, you feel like they wouldn't have made those basic errors that led to both the goals and some of the other chances that Man City got in that game. And then at the other end of the pitch, they didn't really offer much. I think it was a game that felt like a foregone conclusion once it went to 2-0. And of course, listen, if Liverpool had gone to 2-0 up against West Brom, it probably would have been a very similar scenario. So of course, we can't take anything for granted. We have to go into this game and treat it as a similar scenario to West Brom and acknowledge that we didn't deal with that scenario well, and we've got to change the way we play if we want to get past Newcastle. But based on the way they played against Man City, if Liverpool are on it, and generally Liverpool are, like I said, I'm hoping that we deliver a bounce back performance after that disappointing one against West Brom, then we should be able to take Newcastle's defence apart. And then it's just a matter of whether at the other end they've got anything to cause our defence problems. And that's why I do think we go with Phillips over Reece Williams. I said earlier I was going to explain here why I went for that as the option, and I think it's just because Newcastle have essentially got two options for how they try and cause Liverpool problems. It's either going to be set pieces or counter-attacks. For West Brom, in the end, it ended up being set pieces. They kind of had a go with counter-attacks, but it was kind of clear that the quality wasn't there. The ability to break the Liverpool defence down by pressing and then countering and launching on them and trying to take use any numbers advantage by hitting us on the break quickly just wasn't going to work out, because the technique wasn't there to spring those traps with the required speed. And I think Newcastle will be no different, but they'll look at how West Brom scored from a corner, unsettled Liverpool in that position. Of course, without Joel Matip, who was an authoritative presence in the air as well from corners, that'll look like a weak spot. And I think we had a similar situation against West Ham, and we dealt with that by putting Phillips in, and it told, because he ends up getting the Man of the Match award. He wins some crucial headers. He wins one right at the end of the game as well when West Ham are pushing for an equaliser. They get a corner in stoppage time and he just blams it away with his head. And I get the feeling that is exactly what Liverpool are going to need, because against West Brom, one of the worst things we did was we let them think they had a chance of getting back into the game. And Liverpool should, whether they are 1-0 up or 4-0 up, give the impression that there is no chance of the opposition getting a result. Once you start winning, they should feel like they should just give up. And West Brom didn't do that. West Brom felt like they were still in the game, and that's probably why they end up getting the goal. So Liverpool have got to make sure that however Newcastle try and come at us, we've just basically got to very quickly give them the impression that they are completely wasting their time. And with players like Andy Carroll as well in reserve, who we all know plenty about, he is, even though he wasn't at his best at Liverpool, he was still a nuisance in the air, and he's been a nuisance in the air against us as well. So with that in mind, I think Nat Phillips has to play over Reece Williams, and it's also, bearing in mind exactly how things are going to play out against Southampton in around about a week's time, and who should be playing between the two of them for that game. But of course, there'll be more of that later on with the pre-Southampton video in a few days. But in the meantime, I feel like Nat Phillips has to start over Reece Williams for this game, simply for his ability in the air, and then hopefully everything else around his shortcomings in terms of both pace and kind of ability on the ball with passing and playing out from the back and being press resistant and stuff like that. You'd hope that with the other players around him, like I said, Alisson as a reassuring presence, Fabinho one side, either Trent or Robertson the other, and of course some fantastic midfielders in front of him, everything else to do with his shortcomings will hopefully fall into place. But in the meantime, I'm expecting it to be a Liverpool win. I think we will bounce back with a vengeance, if you will, from the game against West Brom. But of course, nothing is guaranteed, especially in a season like this. You simply never know what is going to happen, and Newcastle could spring a surprise. But I think we're still going to get the result. Let me know what you think the result is going to be down in those comments below. Apart from that, that is all for today's video. So thank you guys very much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, as always, you know what to do. Hit the like button down there. Hit that subscribe button there if you are new around here. Check out some of the other videos that have been out on the channel over the past few days. Don't forget to follow at Ellipsis Focus TV on Twitter, and I'll be back tomorrow evening after we've hopefully beaten Newcastle. Until then, bye for now.